I got added to a group chat called Real Family Only and read 847 messages of my mother and sister betting on my downfall. I didn't cry. I screenshot everything. Then I showed up to Grandma's 70th with one sentence that flipped the room and rewrote her will forever today. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My phone lit up at 11:07 p.m. with a notification that felt like an accident, but landed like a verdict. Sienna Harper added you to Real Family Only. I stared at it long enough for my screen to dim. Then I tapped it anyway because my whole life has been built on tapping anyway, showing up anyway, smiling anyway, swallowing anyway. Like if I just kept being easy to deal with, I'd eventually be treated like I belonged. The chat opened and the first thing I saw wasn't a hello, wasn't a oops, wrong person. It was the number in the corner, 847 unread messages. 7 years of my family talking. Without me. About me. I scrolled up, and my thumb moved faster than my brain could protect me. I saw my name in pieces, clipped into nicknames, turned into a punchline. CC. Charity case. The spare. I saw laughing emojis under sentences that should have ended relationships. I saw my mother's words sitting there like a cold cup of coffee you forgot overnight, and somehow it was still strong enough to ruin your stomach. At least she doesn't have kids. One less grandchild to worry about. I didn't even feel the tears at first because shock is like anesthesia. It doesn't heal you, it just keeps you conscious while you bleed quietly. My hands started shaking the way they do when I'm furious and trying to keep my voice civilized, like my body wants to scream, but my upbringing trained it to stay polite. I scrolled, and the messages kept coming, rolling years back like a crime documentary where you already know who did it. You're just finding out how long they've been doing it and how many people clapped. Taking bets on how long her marriage lasts. I give it 18 months. Start the divorce pool now. Pay up, ladies. They didn't just talk about me. They made a game out of me. A scoreboard. A group hobby. I saw my name next to little predictions like I was a bad TV show they couldn't wait to see canceled. Then I found the week my marriage fell apart. The week I called my mother with my voice in pieces. The week I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't walk past a mirror without thinking I must have done something to deserve it. They weren't comforting me behind my back like families do when they're messy, but still love you. They were celebrating. They were collecting money. They were laughing about how boring I was and how they were surprised my husband waited this long. And the worst part wasn't Megan, sorry, not Megan anymore, not in this version. It was my sister Blair, because sisters can be cruel and still pretend it's a personality trait, but my mother was supposed to be the line you don't cross. My mother was supposed to be the place you can fall, without being mocked while you're on the ground. And there she was in black and white, not defending me, not even staying quiet, joining in like she'd been waiting for permission to dislike me out loud. I sat up in bed, and my apartment looked smaller. Like it was embarrassed it couldn't protect me from this, like the walls were too thin to hold all the humiliation I'd been pretending didn't exist. I pressed my palm to my chest, right over my sternum, because that's where it felt like something cracked open, not my heart in the poetic way, something more practical, like a hinge that's been forced too many times and finally snapped, and now there's no closing the door again, even if you wanna. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to call someone. I wanted to call my grandmother first because my grandmother, Marlene, was the one person who never made me feel like a leftover from a life my mother regretted. But it was midnight. She was older. Her heart wasn't great. And I couldn't be the one who drops a grenade in her lap just to relieve my own pressure. So I did what I do at work because I'm an ICU nurse, and when something is chaotic you either panic or you start documenting. I started screenshotting. Not dramatic, not rage typing, not posting anything, just screenshot after screenshot like I was building a chart that nobody could argue with. I didn't miss a period. I didn't skip the names. I captured the timestamps. I captured the laughing reactions. I captured the LOL like it was a signature on a confession. My camera roll became a courtroom. The folder became my air supply. Somewhere around 2:16 a.m., the tears stopped completely, and that scared me more than the crying, because crying means you still want something. No tears means you've started leaving. I scrolled until my hands cramped. I found messages about my job, how I act like I'm saving lives, as if that's not literally what I do. I found messages about my divorce, about my finances, about how I always needs help, even though I've been the one driving Grandma to appointments and cleaning her kitchen when her arthritis flares and sitting with her when she gets scared at night. I found messages from Blair mocking the way Grandma obsesses over me. And then I found the line that made everything click into a new kind of danger. Grandma keeps a notebook. She writes names. I saw Charity Case's name in there like multiple times. My stomach tightened, not from pain now, from realization. Grandma wasn't clueless. Grandma wasn't blind. Grandma was watching. Grandma was collecting receipts the same way I was, only she'd been doing it for years, quietly with a pen, like an old woman writing grocery lists while her family thought they were getting away with everything. That's when my sadness shifted into something colder and clearer. They weren't just cruel, they were sloppy. And when people are sloppy, truth has room to walk in. At 4:19 a.m., I typed one text in the group chat, calm as a pulse check. Thanks for the receipts. That was it. No rant, no paragraph, no threats. Just a sentence that told them I'd seen the whole basement they'd been hiding me in. Then I left the group, and my phone exploded like I'd pulled the fire alarm in a crowded building. Blair calling.
Decline.
Mom calling. Decline. Text stacking like dirty dishes. It's not what it looks like. We were just venting. Every family does this. Don't tell Grandma. This could kill her. Funny how they suddenly cared about Grandma's health when their mouths were the poison. I turned my phone off and slept better than I had in months because for the first time in years, I wasn't guessing. I wasn't wondering if I was imagining things. I wasn't trying to decode why I always felt like I was standing outside my own family's window. I had proof. I woke up at 7 a.m. and the world looked normal, which was insulting. The sunlight didn't know. The coffee didn't know. The city sounds didn't know. Only me and the people who'd been laughing at me for 7 years knew. And the party was in 4 days. Grandma Marlene's 70th birthday. A backyard set up with white chairs and string lights and a photographer because my mother loves an audience and my sister Blair loves a spotlight and both of them love pretending family is everything as long as the family looks good in a picture. Grandma had called me 6 weeks earlier, personally, which should have been my first clue that something was changing. I want you there, she'd said. Her voice was steady, warm, like she'd already decided something and just needed me to show up so she could do it. I remembered every Saturday I'd driven her to cardiology. Every Sunday I'd cleaned her house while she napped. Every night I'd sat beside her on the couch because she didn't want to be alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, Blair posted Christmas photos with captions like, "My heart" and "blessed," and the internet ate it up because people love a neat story. Blair had never once sat with Grandma at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. Blair had never once cleaned vomit out of a sink without making it content. Blair was a performer, and my mother was her stage manager, and I was the unpaid intern who made sure the lights stayed on. 3 days before the party, I called my mother to ask about the dress code, because I'm still the kind of person who tries to cooperate even when I've been stabbed with a smile. "Oh, just casual," she said. "Nothing fancy." I believed her for about 12 hours until I dropped off Grandma's medication at my mother's house and saw a text preview flash across the counter. "Remember cocktail dress. Photographer at 4. My chest went cold.
Casual for me, cocktail for them.
That's how it's always been. Keep me slightly off balance, so I'm easier to manage. Keep me underdressed, so I look like I don't belong. Keep me grateful for being invited, so I don't notice I'm being used." That night I stood in front of my closet, and I didn't feel like a woman choosing a dress. I felt like a soldier choosing armor. I picked navy. Understated. Not flashy, not trying to compete, just enough to say, I'm not the help. I'm not the afterthought. I'm here because Grandma asked for me. The day of the party, my stomach stayed tight the whole drive. Not because I was scared of them, but because I was scared of what I might become if I let myself finally react. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to do a big social media expose. I didn't want to be the thing they'd always accused me of being. Dramatic, sensitive, the problem. I wanted the truth to do what truth does best when it's clean and documented. I wanted it to stand there and make liars trip over their own shoes. I pulled up to Grandma's house and saw the yard transformed. White chairs in rows. String lights like a wedding. A photographer hovering like a vulture in a nice shirt. My mother was already working the crowd, laughing too loud, touching shoulders, performing warmth. Blair was in a light-colored cocktail dress, hair done, smile ready, already posing. When I walked through the gate, my mother's face did this tiny glitch, like her brain wasn't sure which version of me was arriving, the old one who would shrink, or the new one with receipts. Blair's eyes went wide for half a second, and then she plastered on her social smile, the one she uses when she's cornered and needs to look innocent. "You made it," my mother said, too bright. "Of course," I said. Grandma invited me. I wasn't rude. I wasn't sweet. I was factual. And facts are terrifying to people who live on stories. For the first hour, they tried to make me disappear without making it obvious. Servers walked past me with trays like I was furniture. Photos were arranged, so I ended up in the back row. "Better lighting up front," my mother said, like I hadn't spent years watching her strategically place people like props. Guests asked who I was, and Blair answered before I could. "Oh, she's family," she said, vague enough to be insulting, like I was some distant cousin you didn't want to explain. I watched it all like I was watching a documentary about someone else's life, and I kept thinking about the chat. 847 messages. 7 years. The cruelty was never an accident. This was just the public version of what they'd been doing privately. Then Grandma saw me. Not with the fake surprise everyone else does when they haven't called you in months. With recognition. With certainty. She waved me over, and when I leaned in, she squeezed my hand hard, harder than her arthritis should have allowed, and whispered, "Stay until the end." Her eyes were sharp, not fragile, sharp like a woman who's been quiet long enough. My heart started pounding, because suddenly it wasn't just about me confronting them. It was about Grandma confronting them. And Grandma doesn't bluff. Right here, before I go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because I know I'm not the only one who's been the extra in their own family story, and I want to see how far this kind of mess travels. Okay, back to the yard. 2 hours in, Blair clinked her glass and took the portable mic like she owned the moment. People turned, phones came up, the photographer positioned himself for the perfect shot because humiliation loves documentation when it's aimed at the right target. Blair launched into a speech about Grandma, 5 minutes of polished lies, childhood memories that happened once, lessons she learned from Grandma that she repeated like captions, and then she hit the line that made my jaw tighten. "I'm so grateful to be the granddaughter who's been by your side all these years." The crowd applauded. My mother beamed like she directed the whole scene. I stood there in the back and felt something almost funny rise in my throat. Not laughter, more like disbelief, because I could name every appointment date, every medication refill, every night Grandma called me because she was scared, and Blair was up there taking credit for a decade of my life, like it was a brand deal. A distant cousin leaned toward me and whispered, "Aren't you going to say something?" Blair slid in at my elbow like a snake in perfume and answered for me. "Oh, Sienna is so busy with her nursing job. She doesn't really do speeches." She laughed lightly, and a few people chuckled because it's always easier to laugh than to question the script. I looked at Blair, and I wanted to say, "I've seen your group chat. I've read what you call me when you think nobody's listening. I've watched you bet on my pain like it's entertainment." But I didn't.
Not yet.
I just said evenly, "Grandma knows who's actually been there." Blair's smile froze. Across the lawn, Grandma caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that says, "Don't swing early, let the other person walk into the trap they built." The sun started lowering. Guests shifted into that end-of-party energy, collecting purses, checking watches, pretending they have somewhere else to be. My mother was trying to steer the night back to safe territory because she could feel the tension in the air, and tension is the enemy of performance. Then Grandma stood up. Slowly but with purpose. The yard went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like even the string lights stopped flickering just to listen. Grandma tapped her glass. "Everyone stay a moment longer." My mother's smile went stiff. Blair adjusted her dress, like she was preparing for another round of praise. Grandma smiled, sweet at first, then her voice sharpened. I want to talk about what family actually means. The air changed. I could feel it. I could feel people realizing this wasn't the usual toast. Grandma turned her body slightly toward me, not fully, but enough that the crowd's eyes started drifting in my direction. My mother's face went pale because mothers like mine can sense when they're about to lose control of the narrative. Grandma reached into her cardigan pocket, and I saw the edge of something worn, leather, familiar. The notebook. Blair's jaw tightened. My mother blinked fast, like she was trying to reset the moment. Grandma opened the notebook and held it like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. I've kept records, she said, for years. People laughed nervously, assuming it was a cute old person quirk. Grandma didn't laugh. I wrote down who showed up, she continued, and who didn't. Silence. I wrote down who helped when it mattered. My mother's eyes flicked to me, sharp with warning, like she still thought she could manage me with a look. Grandma's gaze moved across the crowd, landing on Blair, then my mother, then lingering long enough to make them both uncomfortable. And tonight, Grandma said, I'm going to say some things out loud that have been whispered for far too long. My pulse hammered. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't scared either. I was ready. And I realized, standing there with my navy dress and my phone full of screenshots, that my family wasn't prepared for the one thing they couldn't manipulate, a quiet person who finally stops absorbing the hit and starts returning the evidence. Grandma lifted her eyes and said my name clearly, Sienna, come here, sweetheart. The crowd parted like a curtain opening. My mother's hand twitched like she wanted to grab my arm. Blair took a half step forward like she wanted to interrupt. Nobody moved fast enough. I walked to Grandma and she took my hands in hers, both hands firm. Stay close, she whispered, and it didn't feel like comfort, it felt like strategy. Then she raised her voice again. There's something else I need to address before anyone leaves. And when she said that, my mother's face did something I'll never forget, because for the first time in my life, the woman who made me feel small looked genuinely afraid that the truth was about to be bigger than her. Grandma's fingers tightened around mine in a way that grounded me, like she was anchoring me to the truth before the room tried to spin it away, and when she looked back at the crowd, her face had changed. Not angry, not emotional, just resolved. The face of someone who has already lived through enough nonsense to stop negotiating with it. Before anyone leaves, she said again, louder this time, I want to clear something up because I'm seeing a lot of smiles tonight that don't match the reality I live every week. You could feel the discomfort ripple outward, chairs shifting, glasses lowering, people suddenly interested in the ground. My mother let out a small, tight laugh, the kind she uses when she wants to signal that something has gone off script. Mom, this isn't necessary, she said. Grandma turned her head slowly, deliberately, the way a judge does when someone interrupts. Diane, she said, using my mother's full name, which she only does when she's serious, I decide what's necessary at my own birthday. That shut the yard up completely. Blair tried to recover, stepping forward with that practiced concern that always reads well on camera. Grandma, you're tired. Let's not make this a big thing, she said softly, hand hovering like she might guide Grandma back into her chair. Grandma didn't look at her. Sit down, she said, calm as weather. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but Blair froze, because people like her aren't used to being addressed without cushioning. She sat. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, but my mind was clear, almost eerily so, like the moment in a trauma bay when everything clicks and you know exactly what needs to be done next. Grandma opened the notebook, flipped a few pages, and the sound of paper moving felt louder than the string lights buzzing overhead. I want to talk about consistency, she said. About who shows up when there's no audience. She read dates, not all of them, just enough. March 2018. Sienna drove me to cardiology and waited 4 hours because the doctor was behind. She looked up. No post about it. No photo. Just presence. My mother's lips pressed into a line. Grandma flipped the page. October 2019. I fell in the kitchen. Sienna slept on my couch because I was scared to be alone. She turned another page. June 2020. Pandemic. Sienna did my shopping every week, left bags on the porch, sat with me through the door when she couldn't come in. A murmur started in the crowd, not loud, but the kind that says people are recalibrating their assumptions. Blair's eyes darted around, calculating. My mother tried again, voice trembling now. Mom, you're making it sound like no one else cares. Grandma finally looked at her. I'm not making it sound like anything, she said. I'm saying exactly what happened. Then she did something I didn't expect. She closed the notebook. And that brings me to something I learned recently, she continued. My stomach dropped because I knew what was coming, but knowing doesn't stop the impact. 6 months ago, Grandma said, someone showed me messages that changed the way I see this family. My mother's breath hitched audibly. Blair stood halfway up, then sat back down, like a child caught moving when the teacher says freeze. Messages. Someone in the crowd whispered. Grandma nodded. A group conversation, she said. 7 years long. You could feel it land. My mother's face drained of color so fast it was almost frightening. Mom, she whispered, please. Grandma ignored her. In those messages, Grandma went on, I saw my granddaughter mocked, dismissed, reduced to a nickname like she was a burden instead of a blessing. She looked directly at my mother now. I saw bets placed on her failures. A gasp escaped someone near the back. I saw laughter at the end of her marriage. Blair's head snapped up. That's private, she said, sharp now, panic breaking through the polish. You had no right to. 847 messages, Grandma said quietly. I read them all. Silence slammed down. My mother started crying then, real tears, the kind that soak into makeup and ruin it. I didn't mean it like that, she said, voice cracking. We were just talking. Families vent. Grandma tilted her head. Do families usually celebrate when one of their own is hurting? No answer. Do mothers usually feel relief that their daughter didn't have children? My mother covered her mouth. Someone in the crowd audibly inhaled. Blair shot to her feet. Grandma, this is insane, she said. You're embarrassing us. Grandma's eyes hardened. Sit.
Down.
Blair hesitated, then sat, because something in Grandma's tone told her this wasn't a fight she could win with charm. Grandma turned slightly, addressing the wider circle. I've been alive long enough to know the difference between mistakes and patterns, she said, between thoughtless words and sustained cruelty. She paused, letting that sink in. And I've been quiet long enough. My legs felt numb. Part of me wanted to disappear because being seen like this, even vindicated, is still exposure, still vulnerability. But another part of me felt taller than I ever had. Grandma reached into her cardigan again, and this time pulled out a folded document. The rustle of paper cut through the air. 3 months ago, she said, I updated my will. The reaction was immediate and chaotic, whispers erupting, heads snapping toward Blair and my mother. You can't just, Blair started. I can, Grandma said. And I did. She unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately, savoring nothing, just making sure every word had room. This house, she read, and the property attached to it, will go to my granddaughter, Sienna Harper. The sound that followed wasn't applause or outrage. It was confusion mixed with shock, like a room full of people realizing the ground rules have changed mid-game. Blair let out a choked sound. What? My mother staggered back a step like she'd been hit. Grandma continued. The rest of my assets will be divided as outlined, but this, she tapped the page. This is non-negotiable. Blair jumped up. That's not fair, she cried. I'm your granddaughter too. Grandma looked at her, not unkindly, but unyielding. Fair is a word people use when they're losing something they assumed they owned, she said. This is about balance. My mother shook her head, sobbing now. I raised her, she said weakly, gesturing toward me like I was evidence in a losing argument. Grandma turned to her fully. And then you stopped, she said. The words were quiet, but they landed like a verdict. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Not because I was panicking, but because the air itself felt charged, heavy with truth that had nowhere left to hide. Grandma folded the paper back up and tucked it away. "I didn't do this to punish anyone," she said to the crowd. "I did it to honor the person who never treated love like a transaction." She squeezed my hand again. "That's all." For a second, no one moved. Then the party dissolved into fragments, conversations breaking off, people avoiding eye contact with my mother and Blair, like proximity itself might be contagious. Blair rushed toward me, mascara streaking now, composure gone. "You did this," she hissed under her breath. "You poisoned her against us." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but distance. "You poison yourselves," I said quietly. I just stopped swallowing it. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My mother stood frozen near the chairs, surrounded by people but completely alone, the social gravity she'd relied on evaporating in real time. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. I felt clarity. Grandma leaned toward me. "Help me inside," she whispered. We walked away from the yard together, leaving behind the string lights, the photographer packing up without his perfect ending, the family that had spent years pretending I wasn't real. Inside the house, the noise dropped away. Grandma sat down, exhaled, and smiled at me like she'd just finished a long, necessary task. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find it was true. Outside, I could still hear voices rising and falling, damage control beginning, stories being rewritten. But inside, in that quiet living room that smelled like lemon cleaner and old books, I understood something I'd never let myself fully believe before. Losing their approval didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. And as I sat there holding my grandmother's hand, knowing the fallout hadn't even started yet, I realized the hardest part wasn't over, not by a long shot, because when people lose the power to define you, they don't go quietly, and what comes next would test every boundary I'd just watched get drawn. The morning after the party felt quieter than it had any right to be, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing, and I woke up on Grandma's couch staring at the ceiling fan, replaying the way my mother's face collapsed when the truth finally had nowhere left to hide, replaying Blair's voice when her mask cracked, replaying the exact second I realized I wasn't shaking anymore, because fear had finally been replaced by something sturdier. And when I walked into the kitchen, Grandma was already there, robe on, kettle humming, notebook open beside her like it always was, and she looked up at me with that same steady smile and said good morning as if she hadn't just detonated the family mythology the night before, as if she hadn't turned 7 years of whispered cruelty into public record, as if she hadn't changed my future with a few calm sentences spoken into a microphone. And that normalcy was what finally made it real, because revenge. Fantasies are loud and dramatic, but real reckoning happens over chipped mugs and toast crumbs. And as I poured coffee, my phone buzzed on the counter like it had been waiting for permission to speak. Message after message stacking up from numbers I recognized, and some I didn't. Blair first, then my mother, then an aunt who hadn't spoken to me in years, then a cousin who suddenly remembered my existence now that it mattered. And I didn't open any of them, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something new. That silence is no longer the same as swallowing pain. Silence can be a choice, a boundary, a pause that belongs to you. And Grandma watched me put the phone face down and nodded like she was watching a student finally use the right formula. "They're going to be loud for a while," she said. Matter of fact, people always are when the story they've been telling themselves breaks. And she wasn't wrong, because by noon the fallout had spread beyond texts into calls, into voicemails layered with apology and accusation in equal measure. My mother crying and saying she didn't raise me to be cruel, Blair switching between rage and pleading depending on the minute, relatives framing themselves as victims of Grandma's supposed confusion. And through it all there was this underlying demand that I fix it, smooth it over, take responsibility for the discomfort they were feeling. The same old expectation dressed up in panic, and I felt something click again, because I finally saw the pattern clearly, how every crisis in this family eventually circled back to me being asked to absorb it, to make it easier, to be smaller so everyone else could stay comfortable. And instead of responding, I went for a walk, just me and the cracked sidewalk and the early afternoon sun, breathing air that felt like it belonged to me, thinking about how betrayal doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like years of being laughed at in a room you're not allowed to enter. Sometimes it looks like love that only flows one direction. And halfway down the block, I stopped and laughed out loud at the absurdity of it all. Because if you're watching this right now and thinking this feels familiar, if you're that person in your family who always senses something is off but can't prove it, I want you to pause with me for a second and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what city, what country, what time it is there, because I promise you this story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever been the uninvited topic of conversation. And when I got back to the house, the messages had escalated. My mother now insisting we meet, Blair threatening legal action she didn't understand, someone suggesting Grandma was being manipulated by me, which would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable, and Grandma listened to one voicemail, shook her head, and said, "They're trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube," then reached for her notebook and wrote something down, and that image stuck with me because while they were scrambling to rewrite the narrative, she was still documenting reality, still anchoring herself in facts. And later that afternoon, Uncle Mark showed up, one of the few who had stayed quiet, his expression tight and conflicted, and he told me he'd read the messages months ago and said nothing because he didn't want to get involved, because he thought it wasn't his place. And I looked at him and realized how many people hide behind neutrality when cruelty benefits them, and I told him calmly that silence is a choice too. That standing by while someone is torn apart in private doesn't make you innocent. It just makes you comfortable. And he didn't argue, he just nodded and left. And that night my phone finally stopped buzzing, not because they were done, but because they'd moved to the next phase, the one where they paint themselves as wounded, misunderstood, unfairly exposed. And lying there in the dark, I thought about how quickly roles flip when the spotlight turns, how the same people who mocked my pain couldn't tolerate their own discomfort for a single day. And I thought about Grandma's notebook again, about how she never interrupted, never exploded. She just observed and remembered. And there's a lesson there that doesn't get talked about enough, that you don't have to react loudly to be powerful. You don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is tell the truth calmly and let it sit. And the next morning brought the next wave, emails this time, carefully worded apologies that took responsibility for feelings but not actions, messages asking what it would take to move forward, as if reconciliation was a transaction they could negotiate back into their favor. And I read them slowly, noticing the absence of real accountability, the way blame was still floating somewhere just out of reach. And I felt oddly grateful because it confirmed what I already knew, that whatever came next wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest. And Grandma sat beside me on the porch as the sun went down and said, "This part is where they test you." And when I asked what she meant, she smiled. "They'll see if you mean it, if you'll fold once the noise gets uncomfortable." And that scared me more than the confrontation ever had, because maintaining a boundary is harder than drawing one. And as the days passed, the family fractured in ways I hadn't anticipated. Alliances shifting, old grievances surfacing, people choosing sides not based on truth but on convenience. And I stayed mostly out of it, not out of fear, but because I finally understood that my presence wasn't required for their chaos to exist. And in that space, I started noticing things about myself. How much lighter my chest felt, how I slept through the night for the first time in years, how I didn't rehearse conversations in my head anymore. And that's when it hit me that this wasn't just about exposure or inheritance or vindication. It was about identity, about who I was when I wasn't performing for approval that was never coming. And that realization brought its own kind of grief, because it meant accepting that the family I thought I had never really existed. Only the version that benefited from my silence did. And as the week closed out and the dust settled just enough to see the outlines of what had been buried, I knew something else was coming. Not a fight, not a confrontation, but a reckoning that would force each of us to decide who we were without the lies. And the hardest part wasn't waiting for them to make their move. It was deciding how much access they'd ever have to me again. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it, and the next choice would shape everything that followed. By the end of that week, the silence stopped being peaceful and started becoming strategic, the kind of quiet that feels staged, like everyone is holding their breath waiting for someone else to flinch first. And that's when I knew the real test hadn't even started yet, because families like mine don't explode once and disappear. They regroup, they rewrite, they try again from a different angle. And sure enough, the next move came disguised as concern, not rage, not blame, but soft voices and worried faces. The kind that make you doubt yourself if you're not careful. Because the first person to show up wasn't Blair or my mother, it was my Aunt Renee, the one who always stayed just far enough away from the drama to claim innocence, knocking on Grandma's door with a pie like it was Thanksgiving and not a calculated entry. And she hugged me a little too tightly and said, "I've been so worried about you," which is a sentence that sounds loving until you realize it always comes right before someone tells you how you've supposedly gone too far. And we sat at the kitchen table with that same wobble in the leg, and she talked in circles about family healing and misunderstandings and how everyone says things they don't mean sometimes. And I listened quietly, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting her talk because I wanted to see how far the revision would go. And it didn't take long before she said it. That line people use when they want you to carry the weight again. "You know how your mother is." She didn't mean it like that. And I asked her calmly what exactly my mother meant when she celebrated my divorce with laughing emojis and betting money, and Renee froze, because there's nothing to say when the facts are laid out without emotion, and that's when she switched tactics, sighing and saying Grandma was under a lot of stress, that maybe public humiliation wasn't good for her heart. And I felt that familiar tug in my chest, that instinct to protect everyone else at my own expense. And I looked at Grandma, who was calmly slicing apples like none of this touched her, and I realized something important, that they weren't worried about her health. They were worried about losing control of the story. And when Renee left without the pie, claiming she suddenly wasn't hungry, I knew the next attempt would be bolder, and it was, because 2 days later my mother asked to meet me alone. No Grandma, no Blair, just us, and a younger version of me would have rushed to that meeting hopeful and anxious, rehearsing apologies that weren't mine to give. But this time I arrived steady, sat across from her at a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso, and watched her hands tremble as she wrapped them around her cup. And she started with tears, real ones, talking about how she failed as a mother, how she was jealous of my bond with Grandma, how Blair needed her more. And for a moment, I felt that old ache, that longing to finally be chosen. And then she said it. The sentence that snapped everything back into focus. "I never thought you'd find out." And there it was. Not regret for the cruelty, just fear of exposure. And I asked her why she never defended me. Not once. And she stared at the table and said, "It was easier to let them joke than to admit I was wrong about you." And that honesty hurt more than the lies, because it confirmed what I'd always suspected, that my pain was convenient, that my role as the family failure made everyone else feel better about themselves. And I told her quietly that love doesn't require someone else to be smaller, that family loyalty isn't supposed to feel like a contract you're always in breach of. And she nodded like she understood. But understanding isn't the same as change. And when she asked what I wanted, I surprised myself by answering immediately. Distance. Not forever, not necessarily, but enough to see who she was without me absorbing her guilt. And she didn't argue, which somehow hurt. 2, because it meant she knew she didn't have leverage anymore. And when I left that cafe, I felt both lighter and lonelier, a strange combination that made the city around me feel sharper, sounds louder, air colder. And if you're watching this right now, and you've ever felt that mix of relief and grief at the same time, pause with me again, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What place in the world you're sitting in while you hear this? Because this moment, this crossroads, happens in quiet rooms everywhere, not just mine. And back at Grandma's house the messages kept coming, but they shifted tone, no longer defensive, now bargaining, offers to start fresh, invitations to family dinners framed as peace offerings. And I watched them carefully, because boundaries aren't proven by what people say when they're scared, they're proven by what they do when they don't get their way. And the first real crack came when Blair showed up unannounced one afternoon, sunglasses on, voice shaking with anger she couldn't fully hide, demanding to see Grandma. And Grandma didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She just said, "You can come in when you're ready to apologize without conditions." And Blair scoffed, calling her manipulative, accusing me of poisoning her. And that's when Grandma did something that changed the entire temperature of the room. She pulled out the notebook again. Not dramatically, just like someone grabbing reading glasses, and started flipping pages, reading dates, times, notes, not to shame, but to remind. And Blair's anger faltered as the record grew longer, because there's something terrifying about being confronted with your own pattern written down in ink. And Blair left without saying goodbye, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. And Grandma sighed and said, "That's grief too." And I asked her if she was okay, and she smiled, and said, "I've been okay for a long time, sweetheart. I just stopped pretending." And that line stuck with me, because pretending is exhausting, pretending you don't hear the jokes, pretending you don't notice the exclusion, pretending you're fine with crumbs when you deserve a seat at the table. And over the next few days, the family divided in quieter ways. Some cousins reaching out privately to apologize, others doubling down in silence. And I realized that exposure doesn't automatically lead to accountability. Sometimes it just clarifies who people really are, and that clarity is both gift and loss. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into that soft hum of evening, Grandma asked me if I was scared of what came next. And I thought about it honestly, about the financial independence I'd built without their help, about the emotional independence I was only now learning. And I told her the truth, that I was scared of repeating the same dynamics in new places, scared of trusting again, scared of being alone in a different way. And she nodded and said, "That's the risk of freedom. You don't get guarantees." And later that night, I lay awake thinking about how betrayal rewires you, how it makes you hypervigilant, scanning rooms for signs of rejection, and how easy it would be to build walls so high no one could ever hurt me again, and how tempting that would feel. And that's when I understood the next challenge wasn't surviving my family's reaction. It was deciding who I wanted to be now that I wasn't defined by their cruelty, because when the role you've played your whole life disappears, you're left with open space. And open space can be terrifying if you've never been allowed to take up any. And the next step, the one I could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon, would force me to choose whether I filled that space with fear or with something entirely new. And that choice would come sooner than I expected. The shift didn't happen loudly, it happened subtly, the way power always moves when it realizes it's been exposed, because after the confrontations, after the apologies that weren't apologies, after the doors slammed and the tears dried, something else crept in, something far more dangerous than open hostility, normalization, the quiet attempt to pretend nothing had changed. And that's when I knew this wasn't over. Because families like this don't stop when you call them out, they stop when you submit again, and I didn't. But the cost of that choice started showing up in places I didn't expect, like my phone suddenly being quiet on weekends, like invitations drying up without explanation, like hearing through secondhand whispers that I'd become difficult, dramatic, different. Words that sound neutral until you realize they're code for someone who refuses to play their assigned role anymore. And I felt it most sharply one Sunday afternoon when I realized no one had checked in on Grandma that entire week except me. Not after the will reading, not after the public reckoning, not even out of concern. And that hurt in a way I didn't anticipate, because I thought exposure would force accountability, but instead it exposed something worse. How transactional their affection really was, how quickly love evaporated when access was threatened. And I sat at Grandma's kitchen table staring at that familiar scratch in the wood, the one I'd traced with my finger 100 times, and I felt this deep, almost primal sadness, not for myself, but for her. Because she'd built her later years around people who loved her conditionally, and she looked at me and said, "They think I chose you over them." And I said, "You chose truth." And she smiled sadly and said, "People who benefit from silence always feel betrayed when you speak." And that sentence settled into me like a truth I'd always known but never named. And over the next few days, the consequences sharpened. Not explosively, but deliberately. My mother stopped calling altogether. Blair unfollowed me on every platform. Cousins who once liked every post suddenly acted like I didn't exist. And there's a special kind of grief in being erased quietly. Not blocked, not attacked. Just edited out like you were never part of the picture to begin with. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't question myself during those moments. Lying awake at night wondering if I'd gone too far, if I should have handled it privately, if standing up for myself was worth losing what little connection I had left. And those thoughts are dangerous because they sound reasonable. They whisper that peace is more important than dignity, that belonging is worth any price. And that's when I need to ask you something directly, because this is the point in the story where a lot of people turn back, where the discomfort makes them retreat. So pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from right now. What city? What country? Because this crossroads happens everywhere, and knowing you're not alone in it matters more than you think. And around that same time, something else happened that forced clarity in a way no argument ever could. Grandma had a minor health scare. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to remind everyone she wasn't invincible. And suddenly the family reappeared like moths to a porch light. Calls, texts, concern layered thick with panic. And I watched it all with a strange calm, because now I could see the pattern clearly. The way urgency only existed when there was something to lose. And when we were sitting in the hospital waiting room and Blair showed up crying, clutching Grandma's hand, saying all the right things, I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just distance, like watching actors rehearse lines I'd heard before. And later that night, when Grandma was stable and resting, my mother pulled me aside and said, "This isn't the time for grudges." And I looked at her and said, "This was never about grudges." And she frowned, confused, because to her everything is transactional. Every boundary is a punishment. Every refusal is a weapon. And she asked, "So, what do you want now?" And I realized she still thought this was a negotiation, still believed I'd trade my self-respect for proximity, and I told her calmly that I wanted consistency, honesty, effort that didn't depend on fear or inheritance. And she stared at me like I'd spoken another language, because those are currencies she's never learned to use. And the next few weeks made something else painfully clear. The family wasn't mourning the harm they caused. They were mourning the loss of control, the loss of the narrative where I was the problem and they were the benevolent center. And when people lose that kind of control, they don't change overnight, they escalate. And the escalation came in the form of rewriting history, stories suddenly circulating about how I'd always been sensitive, how Grandma favored me unfairly, how the chat was just jokes. And this is where betrayal takes on its most insidious form, because it doesn't just hurt you, it tries to erase your reality, to gaslight you into questioning your own memory. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't almost work, because when enough people repeat the same lie, it starts sounding like truth. And that's when Grandma did something I'll never forget. She invited a few extended relatives over, people who'd always been on the periphery, and she told the story herself, calmly, without venom, reading excerpts from her notebook, explaining her decisions, not to justify them, but to document them. And something shifted in that room. Not everyone agreed, not everyone supported her, but the fog lifted, the confusion cleared, and I saw firsthand how powerful it is when the truth is spoken without apology. And after they left, she looked exhausted but peaceful, and she said, "I didn't do this to punish them." And I nodded because I understood. I did it to protect you. And that hit me harder than anything else, because for the first time, someone in my family wasn't asking me to be resilient, wasn't praising me for enduring pain quietly. They were actively choosing to shield me from it. And that changes you. It rewires something deep inside. And yet, even with that support, the loneliness still came in waves, because breaking cycles doesn't automatically build community. It just clears space for it. And space can feel empty before it feels free. And there were nights I sat on the porch listening to the hum of the city, wondering who I was without the role I'd played for so long. The scapegoat, the charity case, the afterthought. And there's a strange grief in letting go of an identity even when it hurt you, because at least it was familiar. And now I had to learn who I was when I wasn't reacting to them, when my choices weren't shaped by fear of exclusion or hunger for approval. And that's not a transformation that happens cleanly. It happens messily, in half steps and second guessing. And just when I thought the dust was settling, just when I believed the worst had passed, something surfaced that forced me to confront the final layer of this betrayal, something that reframed everything I thought I understood about loyalty, legacy, and what it actually costs to tell the truth. And that revelation didn't come from my mother or Blair, or any argument at all. It came from a place I never expected, and when it did, it made one thing terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just about how they treated me. It was about what they were willing to do next to protect themselves. And once I saw that, there was no turning back. What I didn't expect was how quickly the story would try to rewrite itself once the shock wore off, because outrage burns hot and fast, but manipulation is patient. And the moment the family realized the public reckoning hadn't broken me into compliance, they switched tactics. Not louder, not angrier, but softer, sweeter, more dangerous. The kind that shows up with concern in its eyes and knives behind its back. And it began with the calls that sounded reasonable on the surface. My mother asking if we could reset, Blair saying she wanted closure, cousins sending messages framed as neutral check-ins but laced with questions designed to probe for weakness. And at first I thought maybe this was growth. Maybe exposure had finally forced reflection. But the more I listened, the more I realized something crucial. None of them were asking how I felt. They were asking how this affected them, how the story was landing in town, what Grandma was telling people, whether the will could be contested, whether the screenshots still existed. And that's when it hit me with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. This was never about repairing relationships. This was about damage control, about stabilizing a narrative that had slipped out of their hands, and I started noticing patterns I'd missed before. Blair always steering conversations back to money or optics, my mother framing every apology as we all made mistakes, flattening 7 years of cruelty into a shared misunderstanding. And when I didn't respond the way they wanted, when I didn't rush to reassure them that I wasn't angry anymore, the temperature dropped, kindness turning to irritation, patience to pressure, and one afternoon it escalated into something that made my stomach drop. An email from an attorney, polite, professional, requesting a conversation regarding Grandma's estate, citing concern over undue influence. And I laughed out loud when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Because when families like this lose moral ground, they reach for legal ground instead. And that email wasn't really about Grandma's capacity. It was about regaining leverage, about reminding me that power can wear suit and smile. And I showed it to Grandma, expecting anger, but she just sighed, the tired sigh of someone who's seen this play before, and she said, "I wondered how long it would take." And that's when she told me something she'd never said out loud before. That years ago, long before the chat, long before Blair's influencer phase, she'd noticed small things, money going missing, stories changing, her name used to secure favors she never approved, and she'd started documenting not because she was paranoid, but because she'd learned that women who don't document get erased. And as she spoke, I felt something inside me click into place, the realization that this wasn't just a family conflict. It was a power struggle disguised as tradition, and that knowledge changed how I moved through the world in the days that followed. I stopped answering calls immediately, stopped explaining myself, started consulting my own counsel, quietly, strategically, because dignity doesn't mean naivety. And while all this was unfolding, something else was happening beneath the surface, a shift in how I saw myself. Because for the first time I wasn't reacting, I was choosing, and that distinction is everything. And yet even with that newfound steadiness, the emotional weight still crept in during quiet moments, like when I'd sit alone at night replaying conversations in my head, wondering how love had become so conditional, how parents could convince themselves that favoritism was fairness, that cruelty was motivation, that exclusion was protection. And those thoughts can spiral if you let them. So let me pause right here and ask you directly, where are you watching from right now? What corner of the world is this story reaching you in? Because betrayal like this doesn't belong to one family or one country. It's a pattern that repeats wherever silence is rewarded and truth is punished. And knowing you're here, listening, matters more than you might realize. And after that pause, the story took another turn. Because the legal maneuver didn't go the way they expected, Grandma's documentation was airtight, her evaluations current, her intent unmistakable, and the attorney's tone shifted from probing to cautious, which only fueled more resentment on their end, resentment that spilled out in subtler ways, passive-aggressive comments to mutual acquaintances, whispers about my manipulation, about how I'd turned Grandma against them. And I watched as people who once ignored me suddenly formed opinions about me based on half-truths, and that hurt, not because I needed their approval, but because it reminded me how easily narratives can be weaponized, how quickly a woman who speaks becomes a problem to be managed. And there were moments I wanted to scream the whole truth from the rooftops, to post every screenshot, every receipt, to let the world judge, but I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I'd learned something crucial from Grandma, that timing matters, that truth doesn't need to be loud to be lethal. And while they scrambled externally, internally something in me was settling. I started noticing how much energy I'd spent for years anticipating their moods, preemptively shrinking, adjusting my tone, my presence, my needs to avoid conflict, and without that constant vigilance, I felt strangely unmoored, like a limb removed, phantom pain where anxiety used to live. And that's when I realized how deep the conditioning ran, that even freedom can feel uncomfortable at first. And in that discomfort, I began building something new, routines that didn't revolve around family obligation, relationships chosen rather than inherited, friendships where I wasn't the punchline or the backup. And those connections felt different, lighter, but also more honest because they weren't maintained through guilt or fear. And just when I thought the storm had peaked, just when it seemed like the worst had already happened, a final escalation arrived. Not dramatic, not explosive, but devastating in its intent. A public narrative carefully seeded, positioning Blair as the wounded party, the sister trying to heal, the family torn apart by miscommunication, and me cast as the cold one, the one who refused reconciliation. And watching that narrative gain traction was infuriating because it twisted accountability into victimhood, but it also clarified something essential. They weren't trying to get me back. They were trying to save face, to preserve a version of themselves that didn't require introspection. And that realization freed me from the last thread of obligation I didn't know I was still holding. Because you don't owe access to people who only want proximity when it benefits them. And as this chapter unfolded, I could feel the story tightening, converging towards something inevitable, a moment where all these threads, the documentation, the legal pressure, the public narrative, the private grief, would collide. And that moment was closer than I realized, because beneath all the noise, beneath the texts and emails and whispers, a decision was being finalized that would force everyone involved to confront the consequences of their choices. Not in theory, not emotionally, but in a way that would alter lives permanently. And when that decision was revealed, it would make one thing unmistakably clear. Some betrayals don't end with apologies or understanding. They end with boundaries so firm they redraw the map entirely. And once that line is crossed, there's no pretending you don't see it anymore. By the time the dust from the legal threats and whispered narrative started to settle, I realized something unsettling. The silence had become louder than the insults ever were, because silence is where you finally hear what people think you deserve. And what they thought I deserved was nothing unless it came with my compliance. And that understanding changed the emotional temperature of everything that followed. Because now I wasn't bracing for impact, I was watching the collapse in slow motion, noticing how every olive branch they extended was wired to a condition, how every apology was paired with an expectation, how every "we miss you" really meant "we miss control." And it started with Blair sending a voice note late one night, her voice soft, almost rehearsed, saying she'd been in therapy, that she was doing the work, that she wanted to heal our relationship for our future children. Which was almost funny considering she'd once celebrated that I didn't have any, and I remember standing in my kitchen listening to it twice, noticing how she never once said the words "I hurt you," never once acknowledged specific actions, only vague language about everyone being human. And that's when I stopped romanticizing reconciliation, because real repair names the damage. It doesn't dance around it. And when I didn't respond immediately, the follow-up came, not concern but pressure. Messages framed as urgency, like healing had a deadline, like my refusal to re-engage was an attack rather than a boundary. And my mother joined in, calling me to say the family was falling apart, and that I needed to be the bigger person, which is code for be smaller so others don't have to change. And something in me finally snapped cleanly, not in anger but in clarity, because I saw the pattern for what it was, a rigged game where I was expected to absorb harm quietly and then applaud their growth for stopping. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And yet even with that clarity, there were moments of grief that blindsided me, like passing a mother and daughter laughing in a grocery store aisle, or hearing coworkers talk about family traditions, because betrayal doesn't just take people from you. It takes the future you assumed was guaranteed, and that loss deserves to be named, not rushed past. And I let myself feel it fully instead of minimizing it like I'd been taught. And in that grief, I started having harder conversations with myself, asking why I'd tolerated so much for so long, why I'd confused endurance with loyalty. And the answer wasn't weakness, it was conditioning. A lifetime of being subtly taught that love was something you earned by being useful, by not rocking the boat, by accepting crumbs with gratitude, and unlearning that doesn't happen overnight. It happens in moments, small decisions, like not returning a call immediately, like saying no without an explanation, like trusting your own memory over someone else's revision. And while all this internal work was happening, externally the family was unraveling in ways they couldn't hide, alliances cracking, resentment turning inward, because when a scapegoat leaves the system, the dysfunction doesn't disappear, it just looks for a new target. And I heard through secondhand channels that Blair and my mother were now at odds, accusations flying about who caused the world change, who handled things wrong. And there was a dark irony in watching them experience a fraction of the instability they'd normalized for me. And no, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation that the problem was never my sensitivity. It was a system built on avoidance and entitlement. And around this time, something unexpected happened. People I barely knew started reaching out, distant relatives, old family friends, even neighbors of grandma's, sharing quiet observations, telling me they'd always wondered why I was treated differently, why I was absent from photos, why praise skipped over me. And hearing that was both validating and heartbreaking because it meant I hadn't imagined it, and it meant others had seen it and stayed silent, which is another layer of betrayal we don't talk about enough. The bystanders who benefit from peace at your expense. And that realization sharpened my understanding of boundaries even more, because boundaries aren't punishments. They're information. They tell people what access costs, and some people decide that cost is too high, and that's their choice. And somewhere in the middle of all this, I need to pause again and ask you, where are you watching from right now? What city or country is this story reaching? Because stories like this travel far precisely because they echo private truths people rarely say out loud. And knowing you're here, listening, connecting your own experiences to mine, that matters more than you might think. And after that pause, the final phase began to take shape, not with confrontation, but with consequence, because the last thing dysfunctional families expect is consistency. They expect you to break, to soften, to miss them more than they miss control. And when that doesn't happen, when weeks turn into months and your boundary doesn't move, reality sets in. And the first real consequence showed up when holidays rolled around, invitations awkwardly phrased, then quietly withdrawn when I didn't jump at them. And I spent that first major holiday without them, feeling a mix of sadness and peace that was hard to describe, because no one was monitoring my reactions, no one was testing my loyalty, no one was keeping score, and that absence of tension felt like oxygen. And it made one thing painfully clear: love shouldn't feel like survival. And as winter turned into spring, the legal situation finalized completely. Grandma's decisions locked in, unchallengeable, and that door slammed shut with a sound I felt in my bones, because with it went their last illusion of leverage. And that's when the tone changed for good. Bitterness replacing pretense, messages drying up, my name spoken less and less. And you'd think that would hurt more than it did. But the truth is, it hurt less than being half accepted ever had, because ambiguity is its own form of cruelty, and certainty, even painful certainty, is cleaner. And I found myself building a life that didn't orbit their gravity anymore, routines that were mine, relationships that felt mutual, a sense of self not constantly on trial. And I won't pretend it was easy every day. There were nights I doubted myself, nights I wondered if I'd been too harsh, too final. But then I'd remember the screenshots, the laughter at my lowest moments, the casual cruelty framed as jokes, and the doubt would dissolve, because boundaries don't require consensus to be valid. And the closer we got to the inevitable final reveal, the more I understood that the reckoning wasn't just about inheritance or exposure. It was about authorship, about who gets to define reality. And I was done letting people who benefited from my silence write my story for me. And what came next would make that decision irreversible, because some truths, once spoken fully and publicly, changed the landscape so completely that there's no going back to polite denial, no return to pretending things were ever fine. And when that truth finally surfaced in its entirety, it wouldn't just answer lingering questions, it would force everyone watching to confront a hard one of their own. What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from? And that question was about to stop being theoretical. By the time the final reckoning arrived, it didn't come with fireworks or shouting or some dramatic courtroom gasp. It came quietly, the way truth often does when it's done waiting to be believed. And it started on a Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting at my small dining table in my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, sunlight cutting across the surface where I'd once sorted bills and apology drafts I never sent. And my phone buzzed with a notification that told me everything without saying it outright. The estate documents had been finalized and filed, irrevocable, sealed, and legally boring in a way that only deeply consequential things ever are. And I sat there longer than I expected, not crying, not smiling, just breathing, because what hit me wasn't relief or triumph, but a strange calm recognition that the story I'd been living inside for decades was officially over. No more cliffhangers about whether I'd be welcomed back if I behaved differently. No more wondering if love was Just one more sacrifice away, and almost immediately the reaction started to ripple outward. Not directly to me at first, but through the cracks, mutual acquaintances reaching out with cautious curiosity. Messages that began with, "I don't want to get involved," but which is always a lie because involvement is exactly what they're doing. And I learned that my mother had told people she was blindsided and deeply hurt. That Blair was saying Grandma had been manipulated, that I'd turned her against the family, which was impressive considering I'd spent years barely speaking at gatherings. And what struck me most wasn't the accusation, but the consistency. Even now, even with proof, even with consequences, they still needed a villain more than they needed accountability. And maybe that's the clearest lesson I can pass on to you. Some people would rather rewrite reality than rewrite themselves. And that realization freed me in a way I didn't expect, because once you stop waiting for people to understand you correctly, you can finally start understanding yourself honestly. And in that honesty, I began to see the full arc of what had happened. Not just the betrayal, but the system that made it possible. The way jokes softened cruelty. The way silence was rewarded. The way favoritism was framed as practicality. And how I'd been trained to accept less while being told I was lucky to get anything at all. And the final straw wasn't even the will, it was what happened next when my mother showed up unannounced 3 weeks later, standing in the parking lot outside my building with that familiar expression that mixed authority and fragility, like she expected me to open the door simply because she was there, and I didn't. I spoke through the intercom, asked what she wanted, and she said she just wanted to talk, to explain, to clear the air. And I felt a flicker of the old instinct to smooth things over rise up in me before it settled back down again, because I'd already done the explaining for years, and she'd already done the listening selectively, and I told her calmly that I wasn't ready for that conversation, that I needed space, and she snapped then, just for a second, enough to let the mask slip, saying I was being dramatic, that Grandma's decision had gone to my head, and there it was, the real fear. Not that I was hurt, but that I now had leverage I wasn't supposed to. And I told her something I'd rehearsed, but never thought I'd actually say, which was that this wasn't about money or property or winning. It was about trust. And trust once broken doesn't regenerate on demand. And she left angry, tires squealing slightly as she pulled out. And I stood there afterwards shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of choosing myself out loud. And that night, I slept better than I had in years. Because there's something deeply restful about alignment, about your actions matching your values instead of contradicting them. And from there the distance solidified, not with cruelty but with clarity. I stopped responding to indirect messages, stopped engaging in debates about family loyalty, because loyalty that only flows one direction is servitude, not love. And as the weeks went on, something else happened. My world got quieter in the best way. No constant vigilance, no decoding tone, no bracing for the next comment disguised as concern. And in that quiet, I began rebuilding parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd put on hold. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected because I was always managing family crises. I started therapy not to fix myself, but to finally understand myself. And I began noticing how often people apologized when they hurt me, how unfamiliar that felt at first, how healing it was to experience relationships where accountability wasn't treated like an attack. And somewhere around here, I want to pause and ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? What place in the world are you sitting in as you hear this? Because I know for some of you this story isn't entertainment, it's recognition. And knowing that this reached you wherever you are, that matters more than views ever could. And after that pause, the final layer of the reckoning unfolded, not in confrontation but in exposure. Because the truth has a way of surfacing even when you don't push it. A distant cousin I barely spoke to reached out asking directly if the rumors were true, if there really had been a group chat, if they'd really said those things, and I didn't embellish, didn't editorialize. I sent screenshots, dates, names, facts, because facts don't need drama to do damage. And that was the moment the narrative truly slipped out of their control, because it wasn't just my word anymore, it was evidence. And suddenly the family hierarchy that had protected certain behaviors started cracking, not dramatically but steadily. Invitations declined, side conversations cut short, people reconsidering who they aligned with, and I won't pretend that felt good in a revenge sense, but it felt just in a way that was deeply grounding because consequences were finally matching actions, and I realized that was the real payoff, not humiliation but balance. And the biggest shift came internally, when I stopped measuring my worth against people who'd never been qualified to assess it, and I started building a future that didn't require their approval, plans that were mine, Goals that weren't reactions, a sense of identity rooted in who I am when no one is watching. And if you're waiting for a moment where everyone apologizes sincerely and understands you perfectly, I need to tell you something hard and freeing. That moment may never come, and that doesn't mean your boundary failed. It means it worked, because boundaries aren't about changing others. They're about changing your access to harm. And as I stand here now, months later, telling you this story, I don't feel like a victim who got revenge. I feel like an adult who opted out of a rigged system, and that's a different kind of power entirely, one that doesn't need an audience to validate it. But since you're here listening, I want to leave you with this. If you've been told your whole life that family means enduring whatever they dish out, ask yourself, who benefits from that? Definition: because love that demands self-erasure isn't love. It's convenience, and choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest, and honesty is the only thing that creates real peace. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you uncomfortable or seen or angry on my behalf, I want you to sit with that feeling. Maybe even share it in the comments. Tell me if you think my parents crossed a line, or if you've lived a version of this yourself, because these conversations matter. And if you're ready for what happens when boundaries meet real resistance, the next story waiting for you goes even deeper into what people do when control finally slips out of their hands, and why walking away is sometimes the bravest ending of all. By the time everything finally settled, it didn't feel like a finish line so much as a widening horizon. The kind that appears when you've been walking through a narrow hallway for years and someone quietly opens a door you didn't know was there. And that door opened on a morning that looked ordinary enough. Gray Ohio light, coffee gone lukewarm on the counter, my phone face down because I'd learned what peace feels like when you don't flinch at every vibration. And yet, that was the day the consequences completed their slow orbit back to the people who set them in motion, because the silence I'd chosen had started speaking for me in ways I never planned. Neighbors who used to wave now asking gentle questions. Extended relatives reaching out not to interrogate but to check on me. And in those conversations, I realized something important. The truth doesn't need you to shout it when it's strong. It travels on its own. And it travels faster once people recognize the pattern for what it is: a system built to elevate a few by flattening one. And once that recognition clicked, the reactions followed like dominoes, not dramatic collapses but visible shifts. Invitations rescinded, alliances recalculated, reputations quietly adjusted. And if you're wondering whether that felt satisfying, here's the honest answer: it felt clean, because justice without spectacle has a different texture. It's not loud, but it's solid, and that solidity gave me room to do something I hadn't done in years: plan forward instead of bracing backward. And I started by reclaiming my time. The weekends I'd spent anticipating family blow-ups now filled with things that seemed small but added up to sanity. Long walks without headphones, dinners with friends where laughter wasn't a performance, therapy sessions where I finally said out loud the things I'd been taught to minimize, like how being called sensitive is often just shorthand for someone else not wanting to be accountable, and how favoritism isn't always about love, but about convenience, because it's easier to reward the child who reflects you than to support the one who challenges you to grow. And in those weeks, I also learned how grief sneaks up on you even when you've done the right thing, because letting go of the illusion of family still means letting go. And some nights I cried not because I missed the people who hurt me, but because I missed the version of family I'd been promised, the one where showing up mattered more than optics. And if you're listening to this and feeling that ache in your chest right now, I want you to pause with me for a second and tell me where you're watching from, what city or country or quiet corner of the world you're sitting in as you hear this, because I know these stories don't land in a vacuum. They land in kitchens and bedrooms and cars and hospital break rooms where people are deciding whether to keep carrying weight that isn't theirs. And after that pause, the story didn't escalate with another confrontation, but with something more revealing: accountability attempts that arrived too late to be meaningful, a message from my mother that read like a press release, full of vague regret and zero ownership, an invitation to family counseling framed as a gift instead of a responsibility. And I declined calmly, not because I was unwilling to heal, but because healing doesn't begin with gaslighting wrapped in polite language. And when I said no, the reaction told me everything I needed to know: irritation masquerading as concern, urgency that wasn't about reconciliation but about control slipping further away. And I realized then that boundaries aren't tested when people are calm. They're tested when they're inconvenienced. And mine held. And the next wave came from an unexpected place, my grandmother, the quiet architect of truth who had always understood timing better than theatrics, called me one evening and asked if I'd come by. No emergency in her voice, just intention. And when I sat across from her at the small table she'd eaten at for decades, she slid that worn notebook toward me, the one that had held the record of who showed up and who didn't. And she said something that still echoes in me. She said I didn't keep this to punish anyone. I kept it so I wouldn't forget myself. And that sentence reframed everything, because the real power in documentation isn't exposure, it's clarity. It keeps you anchored when people try to rewrite your reality. And that's when she told me what she'd done next, not out of spite but out of protection. Legal steps taken to ensure her wishes would be honored even if pressure came later. Contingencies for care that didn't rely on the people who had already shown their priorities, and hearing that didn't make me feel greedy or triumphant. It made me feel safe, because safety is the foundation that was always missing. And with safety comes the ability to choose generosity without being exploited, to offer presence without being erased, and the ripple effects continued quietly. My mother's social circle thinning as stories contradicted the version she'd curated for years. My sister's online persona taking a hit not because of cancellation, but because authenticity has a way of outlasting filters. And here's the part people don't talk about enough. Watching consequences unfold doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop intervening. You let adults sit with the outcomes of their choices instead of cushioning them. And that was hard. Harder than confrontation ever was, because it required restraint, and restraint is a muscle you only develop after years of being forced into reaction. And in that restraint, I found something unexpected. Humor, the ability to see the absurdity in how seriously people take themselves when the facade cracks, the way moral lectures evaporate the moment accountability arrives. And that humor didn't make me cruel, it made me lighter. And with that lightness came a new sense of direction. I started writing again, not to vent but to process, turning the raw material of my life into insight instead of wounds. And I want to share one of those insights with you now, because it might save you years. Betrayal often hurts most when it confirms a fear you've been carrying silently, the fear that you were never really wanted. But the truth is harsher and kinder at the same time. You were wanted in the way that served others, not in the way that honored you. And that difference matters, because once you see it, you stop chasing the wrong version of belonging. And as months passed, the distance became normal, not tense, just factual. Birthdays acknowledged politely, holidays navigated differently, and the absence of chaos revealed how much energy it had been consuming. Energy I now redirected toward building a life that didn't require me to audition for affection. And if you're waiting for the dramatic apology scene to validate your pain, let me tell you what actually validates it. Peace, the quiet confidence of not needing to explain yourself anymore, the steady rhythm of days that aren't punctuated by dread. And yes, there were moments of temptation to send one last message, to clarify one last time, but clarity doesn't come from repetition, it comes from consistency, and consistency is what changed everything. And now when people ask how I feel about it all, I tell them the truth. I don't feel victorious. I feel aligned, and alignment is addictive. It makes you intolerant of anything that pulls you out of yourself. And as we reach the end of this chapter, I want to leave you with a challenge and a comfort. The challenge is to examine where you're still paying emotional rent in places you no longer live, where you're still explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And the comfort is this: you are not cruel for stepping back. You are not dramatic for naming patterns, and you are not broken for wanting reciprocity. And if this story stirred something in you, I want you to talk about it. Argue about it even. Tell me in the comments whether you think family loyalty has limits and where those limits should be drawn. Because these conversations don't weaken families, they reveal which ones are real. And if you're ready to keep going, the next story waiting for you explores what happens when the person who built their identity on being favored suddenly has to live without an audience, and why the fall from that height is louder than any confrontation ever could be. And trust me, you won't want to miss how that one ends.